Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we will soon need to start, as we are otherwise will be starting a bit late. And I know many of the speakers have other engagements, so we really want to try to keep the time as best as possible. So I would like everyone to take their seat if possible. Excellencies, ministers, colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to be here with you on behalf of the Adaptation Fund and as chair of the Adaptation Fund. And as this event is also generally co-hosted by the COP26 presidency. And it is truly a pleasure to see you all again. And to see the commitments to support the Adaptation Fund and the UNFCCC process more broadly. The commitment and support is crucial for the fund. As more than ever, it is clear that we are in an urgent situation when it comes to climate adaptation. The Adaptation Fund is a vehicle for activating countries and communities to be better prepared and more resilient to climate change. With its focus on concrete adaptation action, the fund has been delivering effective programs to the most vulnerable with more than $850 million US, portfolio covering over 100 countries, including 33 least developed countries and 19 small island developing states so far. And it was created in 2001 and launched in 2007. Over the pandemic months, the fund has continued to deliver, demonstrating clearly that it is capable of more. The fund has continued to function successfully during the pandemic, maintaining its volume of finance on the same level as before the pandemic. Moreover, it has launched new financing windows, for which it has already received exciting proposals that promise to move the mission forward and closer to the goal of resilience. It has also carried out monitoring missions, virtually, of course, and adapted and adjusted its operation in innovative ways, some of which may be retained in the future. This all speaks to the nimble nature of the fund and its collaborative culture it has been able to establish with its stakeholders. As the chair of the board of the Adaptation Fund, I'm happy to see such distinguished guests in attendance. Sorry. Okay, yeah, thank you. So I have the pleasure of introducing each of our distinguished speakers today, many of whom you see sitting here, and some of whom you will see on the screens. I really hope you will enjoy this event, as this is one of the highlights, is what is too often seen, in what is too often seems like a gloomy picture. The Adaptation Fund is a reminder there is cause for optimism and that multilateralism is the way forward. With this, let me start by introducing His Excellency Ovais Sarmad. We will start by introducing Her Excellency Ms. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Secretary of State for International Trade and COP26 Champion for Adaptation and Resilience, the United Kingdom. Please, Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Honoured guests, it's my great pleasure to be addressing you today. Thank you to all participating in this Adaptation Fund contributor dialogue. And also thank you to the Secretariat for their work in preparing this event. Adapting to climate change has never been more pressing. As the UK's international champion on adaptation and resilience for the COP26 presidency, I have had the privilege of listening to people and communities from around the world who are at the forefront of climate change. I had the honour of meeting the Murillo indigenous community in Costa Rica and hearing of their challenges in the face of climate change. In Ghana, I heard from cocoa farmers and met young people sharing their experiences of living with climate change. The IPCC is unequivocal that human-induced climate change is already affecting every region across the world. Failure to respond and prepare for the current and future impacts of climate change will be catastrophic. So we, as an international community, must do more to help support and drive the delivery of effective adaptation on the ground. Collectively, we are all on a journey to ensure everyone is resilient to current and future climate risks. This is what we as a presidency are seeking to catalyse and will continue to champion through to the African presidency at COP27 and beyond. To support the transformation required to not just survive but thrive, there is a significant need to scale up both finance for adaptation and finance relevant to loss and damage. We must improve direct access to finance through increasing the proportion of finance that reaches the local level. That's why we have made locally led adaptation a central approach to our presidency, and why we launched the Task Force on Access to Finance to improve financing behind action in national and local plans, including the NAPs. Those who did least to cause this climate crisis are the most vulnerable to it. This cannot go on. It is not fair. We must, with the greatest urgency, put our finance where our words are and our pledges are. As COP26 President, we are committed to closing the gap between the first and the last, to put the last first and together leave no one behind. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for your leadership and your preparations for the meeting and the continuation until the COP27, as you mentioned, in Egypt. And I would like now to introduce the next speaker, who is the Deputy Secretary, we will have to change the order. So we will. I will now introduce instead His Excellency Ms. Jasmine Fouad, Minister of Environment for Egypt. Please, Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear Minister, Anna Maria, my sister, dear Excellencies and colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to speak at this very important event of Adaptation Fund Contributor Dialogue, which take place at a very timely manner. And moment of this COP26, which puts a strong emphasis on adaptation finance. More than ever, as we have been hearing all over the year, adaptation and adaptation finance are very much needed. Estimated adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 times greater than the current public adaptation finance flows. And the adaptation finance gap is really getting bigger and becoming more wider. This is evident from the latest UNEP gap report. The Adaptation Fund is an important delivery channel for country-driven adaptation finance. In fact, it's one of the oldest institutional and financial mechanisms that were created in order to support that as part of the UNFCCC. For over more than a decade, the fund has supported vulnerable countries. We're one of them that has been supported by the Adaptation Fund to address climate change in different sectors. However, the available resources in the fund is not enough for supporting the needs of the developing country. And there is a need, definitely, as being called earlier, to do that balance between the finance for mitigation and adaptation. With the fund serving the Paris Agreement since 2019, its role is more important than ever. And as Egypt is nominated to host the upcoming COP27, we welcome the tangible and concrete actions supported by the fund in over 119 countries so far. Its support has allowed countries to build long-term resilience in many ways. To enable the fund to continue its important work, we are also committed to advocate for its resource mobilization effort and greatly welcome all the voluntary contributions so far. The fund has reformed the delivery of the climate finance. Many of the projects that has been implemented by the fund are scalable projects and ensure the country ownership. For example, in Egypt, Egypt was allowed only, $10 million for 2 projects. But we come and see that the second project was an upscale for the results and the success of the first projects. And this is in itself stimulates and pushes further the ownership and the progress at the national level. The fund is really making a positive difference. Projects are building resilience beyond the climate threat, including issues like health, environmental, and economic risks, especially with the COVID-19. But the fund will need to increase its available resources to maintain its path with the high demand. And there will be more high demand now, with more countries progressing and finalizing their national adaptation plans. That's another window where countries have been progressing, and we called countries in order to develop those plans. The more plans are progressing and finalized, the more demand for projects to be funded. Facing record highs in new proposal and an active pipeline of over $300 billion and more to come, the fund still needs more additional support. We welcome the recent decisions by the fund board to increase the country cap from the 10 million to the 20 million, and the number of national implementing entities to 2 per country. These are really very positive developments that we witness for the developing country and for the recipient countries. Let me end by expressing my gratitude to all the contributors around the table who are stepping in to support the Adaptation Fund, including the first time those who contributed are most welcome this year. Rest assured that this money will be well spent and will help reach more vulnerable communities with urgently needed adaptation solution actual on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those words, Minister Fouad, and I was very happy to hear your support for the fund and what the fund has done in your country, and the need for increased funding, and how the way you see forward for the fund. So thank you for highlighting those issues. I now, for the 3rd time, would like to introduce His Excellency Ovaid Sarmad, Deputy Executive Secretary for the UNFCCC. At last, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and very good afternoon to distinguished delegates, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, and friends. It's a great pleasure for me to be here representing UNFCCC on behalf of our Executive Secretary who couldn't be here. This is important, and adaptation in our Secretariat, we take it extremely seriously, so therefore our presence here is extremely important as well, especially on the Adaptation Loss and Damage Day at COP26 today. The illustration of the images tell us the very human story behind what the fund has already achieved. $850 million have been allocated to climate adaptation activities impacting some 31 million people in developing countries. And this is a strong beginning. From building flood defenses to setting up early warning systems for cyclones to empowering women to restore wetlands, to name just 3 such undertakings. All have had a positive impact for those on the front lines of fighting climate change. These include the indigenous populations, citizens of most vulnerable countries, youth, smallholder farmers, and many other affected stakeholders. With many of the projects utilizing nature-based solutions and localized approaches, it is encouraging to hear that more than 381,000 hectares of natural habitats have been preserved or restored through the support of the Adaptation Fund. And as we all know, and we also heard from Minister Fouad, the need always outstrips the availability of resources. This is why contributions to the fund are so important and why all of you are so important. Let us now turn to the matter of adaptation funding more broadly and within the context of Paris Agreement. When it comes to resource allocation, the Paris Agreement is absolutely clear and calls for a balance between adaptation and mitigation. But until now, unfortunately, that has not been the case. The UNEP Gap report, as was also referred to just now, points out that the opportunity to use the fiscal recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and trillions of dollars have been put aside or being invested in the recovery. Prioritizing green economic growth is largely being missed. Again, a missed opportunity. And that while policies and planning are growing for climate change adaptation, financing and implementation are still far behind where they need to be. The good news, however, is that some countries have recently made new commitments to increase finance to support developing countries to empower them to deal with the impacts of climate change. They include commitments from Japan, Australia to double their adaptation finance, and commitments from Switzerland, the United States, Canada for the Adaptation Fund, and we are very grateful for that. We must keep the momentum going, especially here in COP and the second week as we have entered just now. We must echo the voices of all those who are here at COP26 and on the streets of the world who have been calling for stronger adaptation action. And we must forge ahead towards the global goal on adaptation and help vulnerable countries get the support they need to formulate and implement a national adaptation plan. Once again, 126 out of 154 developing nations have begun working on national adaptation plan, with many of them supported by the Green Climate Fund. And according to the UNEP, 79% of the countries have adopted at least one national level adaptation planning instrument, an increase of 7% since 2020. But much work for adaptation is still in front of us. We will, of course, continue to press this matter with the parties over the course of this COP and in the months to come. I really sincerely appreciate and thank all of you for your attention to the issue of adaptation and your ongoing support to the fund itself. And I look forward to working with all of you, and you can count on the support of the Secretariat. And last but not least, thank you for coming to Glasgow during this unprecedented and extraordinary times to show your support and for your engagement. And hope we can get out of Glasgow safely and with good decisions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, for highlighting, setting us in the bigger context, setting the scene, and pointing out the need for increased climate adaptation finance, but also that there has been governments coming forward at this COP. I now would like to introduce our next speaker, who just arrived. His Excellency, Mr. John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, United States. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that, and I apologize for creeping in at the last minute. Like all of you here, I'm really pleased to be here at this important conversation about adaptation and resilience, kicking off, obviously, the second week, but the critical week, and a year in which I think it's safe to say, I've said this before, and I'm finding agreement among my fellow ministers who've been to COPs through the years, that there is really a greater sense of urgency and a greater sense of cohesion so far. Obviously, a few tough issues to get over the hurdle in this week. But it's clear that this week is a week that can define a decade. And obviously, and I repeat this every chance I get, if we don't reduce enough emissions in 2020, 2030, we don't keep 1.5 degrees alive. We also don't get to net zero 2050 barring the discovery of some incredible invention that, you know, sucks carbon out of the sky. So that the stakes here obviously could not really be higher, and we're all getting a little bit jaded because we keep hearing about the stakes and can't get higher, and we've all been talking this language for so long and thinking these thoughts for so long, and then they get repeated and repeated, and it dulls the senses to a degree and becomes rote, and we can't allow it to be rote because it's real, and particularly real for people who are already feeling the impacts in one part of the world or another, for people who are already losing their lives in one part of the world or another. So from the World Leaders Summit until today, I don't think I can recall a COP in which there have been as many initiatives or as much money or as much ambition laid on the table. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that the mission as we leave here will be, yes, to make sure the money's there, but to follow through on everything. The follow-through is going to become the key. And it's important for all of us to think about that. But this week is the week that does define the decade. And we've had encouraging news from Fatih Birol and the IEA about what the meaning is of all the things that have been put on the table, though we can't take any of it to the bank until it really is implemented and starts to get done. But obviously, one of our missions here this year, adaptation, is clearly more urgent, clearly more important, clearly more on the table than it has been at any other time. And it should be. It is appropriate. Because those are the folks, the island states, the vulnerable countries, where the impacts most present the challenge of environmental justice. I mean, these are folks who didn't contribute to it, but who suffer the most, and who have the least ability to be able to build the defenses to withstand it. So we have to prepare for what the warmer world is going to bring. And that does mean investing in a climate-resilient future and supporting those countries and communities amongst us that are the most vulnerable. So I'm not going to go through all, I mean, you know, again, that's part of the repetition, but Mother Nature is pretty angry and sending us about as powerful a set of messages as we've ever received from anywhere. You know, I spent 28 years in the U.S. Senate. I voted thousands of times, and I remember agonizing over some of those votes, and other parliamentarians here know what I mean. Who's winner, who's loser, what happens, what are you giving up? This is a no-brainer. This is the easiest thing anybody ever had to think about in public life, because it's really all upside, and on the other side, it's really all downside. So, at the UN General Assembly, President Biden announced that we're going to quadruple our support for developing nations. And working with other countries, we're on track. I know there's anxiety here about the $100 billion, where it's been. I just speak to it very directly. I mean, President Obama was here today. We were just reminiscing about it. We rushed $1 billion out because we knew when Donald Trump was elected that if we didn't, it wasn't going to happen. And it didn't happen. 3 years. But our budget process doesn't allow you to either go backwards or to start in the wrong place. You have to start where you are, and that's in the 23 budget now. So, but that's not an excuse for not getting the money. When we came in, there was about $67 billion. Now there's 98 or so, 95, 98. And we're trying to close that gap even in these days while we're here. Japan made a very important contribution just the other day. So 98 billion this year and 100 billion next and the next and the next, and on we go. But what's also exciting is not only are we talking about the billions being there, but we are talking about trillions being there. And I'm saying to you, not all of it is real, but a hell of a lot of it is real. And the key is going to be working together to be able to bring nations to the table so we can deploy that money. And again, President Obama just mentioned he wants to be involved in that. He wants to help. We need to build a consortia that's going to really leverage that money into with blended finance, with philanthropy, with concessionary money from governments. This can happen. President Biden has announced his emergency plan for adaptation and resilience. It's known as Prepare. And he's committed to work with Congress to provide $3 billion in adaptation finance annually for this program. And that is going to be the cornerstone of our response to the impacts on climate change and a coordinated whole-of-government approach. And in keeping with that whole-of-government approach, we have about 50 members of the Senate and House who will be moving through here in the course of this week, and we're here over the weekend. We have 12 members of the Cabinet and of agency heads, and we are all committed to working for it. So we will also be providing technical expertise to support more than 500 million people in developing countries who need to adapt and manage the impacts of this change by 2030. So, folks, we see the Adaptation Fund as a key partner in this effort. It's led the way in supporting developing countries as they adapt to climate change, from pioneering the direct access approach to building institutional capacity, investing in small-scale, locally led adaptation initiatives, to the new innovation facility that will scale up and accelerate new adaptation practices and technologies. And the Adaptation Fund will bring us closer, for sure, to a climate-resilient future. That's why I'm pleased to announce that we intend to work again with the Congress to provide $50 million immediately to the Adaptation Fund. And I'm pleased to say that just because of where people's heads were a few years ago versus where they are now, this represents first ever contribution from the U.S. because I think there's been a shift of thinking under the Biden administration about the criticality of adaptation. So we hope to join all of you here in unlocking significant increased adaptation funding, with the reminder that we must do what we must do to raise ambition on mitigation, because we have 65% of global GDP committed to real plans that have been certified to be able to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And I'm going to keep repeating this. 65% of global GDP is there already with plans to keep 1.5 alive. That's Canada, Japan, South Korea, the US, the UK, the EU, South Africa, and I think that's the bundle that equals 65. And the G20, as you all know, the 20 countries equal 80% of all the emissions. So if we create the template with those 20 and move fast enough, then we can actually reduce the long-term need for resilience and adaptation because we're keeping the 1.5 alive. The important message to all of you is that it's doable. It's doable. But if 65% is in, that means that 35% is not. And that 35% can kill all our hopes. If we don't do enough, 2020, the scientists say you got to reduce by 45% in this decade. And unfortunately, the synthesis report, which studied all the NDCs before we came here, said that all the NDCs, 191, said that at the end of that 10 years, we would be 16% increase in emissions. That's the difference that it makes for the missing parties with respect to ambition. So, folks, this is critical. Delighted a day has been dedicated to this, as we've dedicated days to each of the sort of sectors and disciplines we have to use here. But we think that working with the ambition, the High Ambition Coalition, and working with the Adaptation Fund itself, building on an excellent track record that helps people and protects ecosystems and continues to accelerate our work, we can get there. And that's what makes this actually a very particularly hopeful moment on the Monday of the second critical week. So thank you very much, Chair, and I appreciate joining everybody in this effort.
I would like to really thank His Excellency Mr. John Kerry for those words and the support of the US for the Adaptation Fund and the first ever contribution to the fund. Also for highlighting how, of course, interconnected emission reductions are to the needs of adaptation and the need for more ambition, but also that we see things happening at this very COP. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Patricia Fuller, Ambassador for Climate Change of Canada. Please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Broman. Greetings, Ministers, Secretary Trevelyan. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Government of Canada and a privilege to speak with you in support of the Adaptation Fund and to recognize the tremendous value of the fund over the course of more than a decade. As has been noted, the Adaptation Fund has committed almost $1 billion in critical finance to help vulnerable communities worldwide. It has aided close to 30 million people in almost 100 countries. And yet, there's much more to be done through the Adaptation Fund, and the time to do it is now. Canada recognizes that support for climate adaptation is critical, now more than ever, for developing countries, in particular the poorest and most at risk. The communities that are facing climate shocks that are having a profound impact on agriculture, infrastructure, and citizens' well-being. And that is why Canada has doubled its international climate finance commitment to $5.3 billion over the next 5 years. And as part of that allocation, we are committing a minimum of 40% of that amount to adaptation. We are also committing that 40% of our climate finance commitment will be channeled as grants. Last week, to get started with this new commitment, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced up to $57.5 million in investments to help the poorest and most vulnerable communities increase resilience to climate change. And these investments included Canada's first contribution to the Adaptation Fund. And I'll note in doing so, we are joining a subnational government in Canada, which has already been a contributor to this fund. So Canada's contribution is up to $10 million for the Adaptation Fund, and this demonstrates our commitment to support climate adaptation internationally. We recognize not only the financial value of the Adaptation Fund, but also the importance of the leadership role that developing countries play in its management. We're honored to be part of this discussion, to join forces with others to support developing countries' full ownership of adaptation projects, from planning through to implementation. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Ambassador, for stepping forward and supporting the Adaptation Fund with a contribution. It's much appreciated, of course. Our next speaker, who I would like to introduce, is His Excellency Mr. Per Olsson Frid, Minister for International Development Cooperation of Sweden. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chair, Excellencies and distinguished members of the Adaptation Fund Board, ladies and gentlemen. Also for me, of course, a pleasure to be here. Now, we all know that we are faced with a very narrow window, less than 10 years, to drastically reduce global emissions and prevent irreversible damage to our planet, livelihoods, and ultimately our lives, not mentioning the lives of future generations. Right now, we are facing a number of parallel and intertwined crises. Climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, COVID-19 pandemic. And while these crises are mutually reinforcing, our solutions must also be as interlinked. And indeed, true adaptation incorporates and harnesses the unlimited potential and values of biodiversity. And while it's clearly critical to bring down our global CO2 emissions to zero as soon as possible, we also have to build resilience to climate change in the best way possible. The world is in need of a new economic model that takes nature and its ecosystems into account as the precious resources they are, and that we are completely dependent on for our survival. The global economy has to emerge into a climate economy. And building back better and greener is thus the flip side to the coin of a sustainable climate policy. As we tackle the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19, we also need to make sure that we build a society that our children can grow and prosper in. And to be frank, colleagues, for adaptation, that means that as we scale up adaptation finance, we have to make sure that those resources are not primarily channeled to protect our trade routes, but instead to protect the most vulnerable people and communities. Sweden has therefore been a firm supporter of and contributor to the Adaptation Fund for more than 10 years. The fund is a nimble, well-run, effective and experienced player in the adaptation field. And I want to highlight the fund's work with building local and national capacity, community-led adaptation that is crucial to withstand the devastating effects of climate change. And I want to acknowledge, as a feminist, the efforts made in the past few years to mainstream gender equality into project design and implementation. And moreover, I'm very pleased to note the process of adopting also policy to enhance civil society engagement. This is vital, as we all need watchdogs and many advocates for policy change. I would warmly welcome even more interaction between the fund and civil society. Now, in 2019, Sweden signed the Adaptation Fund's first ever multi-year donor agreement. And the 4-year agreement provides the fund with approximately $15 million per year between 2019 and 2022, providing much needed financing predictability. And I would like to urge all donors to consider generous contributions and multi-year financing for the future in order to enhance the predictability and effectiveness of the fund, which has been serving the Paris Agreement for a number of years now. This is the best way for us to reach the most vulnerable communities. Now, colleagues, coming to an end, I also want to share the news that my government recently announced its intention to double climate mitigation and adaptation financing by 2025. Based on our bilateral experiences, requests from partner countries, this has led to a situation whereby our climate aid is more or less 50-50 between adaptation and mitigation as of today. Investing in adaptation, making adaptation finance accessible for the most vulnerable communities is not optional. The cost of not doing so is far greater than investing in what we know we have to do for people and for planet. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Minister Fried, for highlighting the support of Sweden and your personal engagement for adaptation finance, and also showing us the links between biological diversity and climate change, and not at least you were highlighting the work the fund has done for gender equality in program design. I would now like to introduce our next speaker of today, His Excellency Mr. Ville Skinnari, Minister for Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade of Finland. Please, Minister, the floor is yours. It will be via video.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are all aware of the urgency of climate action. The need to adapt and build resilience is growing rapidly, even if we stopped all emissions today. Changing climate and extreme weather events impact livelihoods, health, and security of people in all regions. The hardest hit are those already in vulnerable positions, thus increasing inequalities. The health of our ecosystems is also at risk. Dear friends, the gap between adaptation needs and available finance is still too large. Finland, as a part of the Champions Group of Adaptation Finance, is working together with vulnerable developing countries to improve access to adaptation finance. Our government program puts emphasis on scaling up climate finance and having a balanced distribution of funding between adaptation and mitigation. We are indeed walking the talk. We are increased, and we have increased our total international climate finance by 80% during the current government term. It is my great pleasure to announce our pledge of 7 million euros to the Adaptation Fund. We do appreciate the fund's continued relevance in the global climate finance architecture, facilitating direct access and delivering adaptation solutions on the ground. The innovation facility will hopefully pave the way for more intensive private sector engagement in adaptation. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of inclusiveness and coherence. Working together with other actors and funds will enable both innovation and scale-up of adaptation solutions. Participation of women, girls and marginalized groups ensures no one will be left behind. Let us not forget adaptation also brings many opportunities. Reduced risk and avoided losses, potential to drive innovation, increased productivity and numerous social and environmental benefits. We are excited to engage and support the Adaptation Fund's key role in accelerating this work. Thank you.
I would like to thank His Excellency Minister Skinnari for his remarks via video link. Hope he can hear us now. Nevertheless, I listened carefully to that Finland is now contributing, pledging for the first time to the Adaptation Fund, which is a sign of what the Minister was saying, that Finland is belonging to the champions group of adaptation, and that they are looking to balance the funding between mitigation and adaptation, which is important. Our next speaker on the list is His Excellency Mr. Eamon Ryan, Minister for Environment, Climate and Communications of Ireland. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to meet and discuss adaptation today, and more importantly, the ability to work together now to support the great work of the Adaptation Fund into the future. We know that individual country investments in adaptation are insufficient. The estimated adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 times greater than current public adaptation finance flows, and the gap is widening. Ireland is a global champion of adaptation. This is a key priority for our international climate action in response to in particular to the needs of least developed countries, small island developing states, and those communities most exposed to and already living with the impacts of climate change. Ireland already has a strong record on adaptation. It is the main focus of our climate finance, and our assistance is primarily and overwhelmingly grant-based. We support efforts in climate-vulnerable countries to strengthen their resilience to climate change in the longer term, particularly in areas such as agriculture, food production and research and innovation. Ireland also endorses the principles of locally led adaptation and is one of the first two donors to the LIFE AR initiative on locally led adaptation, along with the United Kingdom. To contribute further to the global landscape and adaptation, Ireland launched the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance as part of the UN General Assembly in New York in September, along with Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Finland and the UK, we've heard from here today. The aim of this group is to increase the total share of climate finance spent on adaptation and resilience, particularly for LDCs and SIDS. Member of this group will lead by example in committing to a balanced approach in our public climate finance. We will advocate for improved quality and accessibility of adaptation finance, and we encourage other finance providers to join us in these efforts. Ireland, together with the members of the Champions Group, will also hold a side event at the Resilience Hub this evening at 6 o'clock, and colleagues are more than welcome. I was delighted when last week our Taoiseach, Ireland's Prime Minister, announced that Ireland will more than double our climate finance by 2025, so that we are delivering at least €225 million each year. We've seen strong commitments also by others, including on adaptation finance. Coming back to the quantity and quality objectives, we must ensure that every cent of this increased finance is being used effectively and efficiently in addressing the vulnerabilities of those most in need. Quality adaptation action means looking beyond assessing greenhouse gas reductions and finance flows. We need to measure the impact on the ground and how adaptation action helps communities to cope with their changing environments. I'm delighted to announce today that Ireland's continued and increased support to the Adaptation Fund in 2026, which will now include providing a contribution of at least €10 million between now and the end of 2022. I look forward to working with the Adaptation Fund on this collective challenge of improving the quality and accessibility of adaptation funding, particularly for the most vulnerable countries in LDCs and SIDS. Thank you.
I would like to thank Minister Ryan for his remarks and the leadership that Ireland is showing for climate adaptation, and not least the pledge that you made for the Adaptation Fund. Our next speaker on the list today is Mr. Jochen Flashbart, State Secretary from the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety of Germany. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. I've been several times here at this contributors dialogue for the Adaptation Fund. It was always a pleasure, and it's also good to see that the number of friends are growing. That's good for the Adaptation Fund, and it's good for adaptation itself. Colleagues, I worked, and Patricia Fuller already spoke about our endeavor on that. I worked together with Jonathan Wilkinson on the 100 billion delivery plan for overall climate finance, and learned a lot by that. Number one is there's a good story. During the last weeks, we catched up, and we are very close to deliver quite soon. We have been a bit late, but over the time, the money will flow, the 100 billion that were committed. Germany always has been, I would say, in all humility, a convinced partner for developing countries to deliver climate finance. We have just announced to enhance it from 5 billion in 2020, it was even a bit more, to 6 billion in 2025. And I just want to underline that it's nothing to do with generosity. It's our feeling that we need to contribute as a matter of fairness and responsibility. And colleagues, when we worked on the delivery plan, we also looked into the share of adaptation finance in the overall money that is provided. And it counts to the latest figures, 2019, about 25%. In Paris, we agreed for a balanced share. So I've never been very good in mathematics, but 25% is definitely not a balanced share. So we definitely support all the endeavors to get a 50-50% split for publicly provided money. Colleagues, why do we support the Adaptation Fund from the German governmental perspective? We like it. We like you. You are doing good things. You are doing good things on the ground. You are close to the communities who know what is needed. We see that you have been enormously innovative, given the quite limited amount of money, and that you were seeking for ways to most efficiently spend the money at hand. We we have now more than 10 years experiences, and before coming to the end and to our own contribution, I want to mention two things. Number one, the need for adaptation is increasing. And that is not coming as a surprise, because climate change is happening, and even with more brutality than we ever expected. The need is increased, and the capacity of our developing countries partners is also increasing. So I think it was very logic to raise the cap for countries to $20 million now. Number two is a lesson learned, and that is something about trust. Those who are dealing with the Adaptation Fund for a bit longer might remember that at the very beginning, when we were talking about the governance, there was a lot of suspicion on one side of the world that if the majority in the decision-making processes is with the developing countries. I think it is proof that this suspicion was wrong. Did the developing countries misuse their power? No. Did they do something good with it? Yes. Therefore, we are very happy to be part of this family, and I'm very happy to announce that Germany, on top of what we did so far, that was 390 million euros over the time, will add another 50 million euros. It's a bit more than in dollars, just to push a bit the competition. And as I worked on the delivery plan, I know how important delivering is, and therefore we made sure that the money is already transferred to the bank account, Miko, of the Adaptation Fund to be available for you. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the State Secretary of Germany for those remarks and for being such a long-term the long-term commitment that you've shown to the fund and being the biggest contributor, but also you were highlighting that this is a question of fairness and responsibility, as you see it, providing climate finance to the most vulnerable communities in the world. And also that you were pointing to that the fund has been very close to the communities, and that is something that you cherish. And I also take your remarks noted that 50 million euros is more in US dollars. Thank you for your support. My next speaker on the list is His Excellency Mr. Benoit Charette, Minister for Environment from Quebec, Canada. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Merci, bonjour à tous. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today on the occasion of this contributors dialogue. I would like to sincerely thank the COP26 President, Alok Sharma, for the invitation. Let me start by first saying that Quebec has been committed to tackling climate change for nearly 20 years now, in order to both protect the environment and ensure a sustainable economic development. Recently, we launched our plan for a green economy, in which we doubled our budget dedicated to the fight against climate change. While it is necessary to implement initiatives to fight climate change at the local level, it is just as important to contribute to the global efforts to decarbonize our economies and adapt to the impact of climate change. States and regions can and have to be drivers of change at the international level. Over the last several years, we have implemented a series of initiatives that help support clean tech transfers and capacity building in developing countries that are the most vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change. We put in place an international climate cooperation program with a budget to this day of more than 30 million for the benefit of Francophone countries that are deemed most vulnerable to climate change. We are planning to add another 30 million in the coming years. In addition, we have been financing several international scientific collaboration initiatives through URANOS, which is Quebec's leader group on regional climatology and adaptation. In 2023, they will host Adaptation Future, the UN Conference on Adaptation to Climate Change. We hope to see you all in Montreal. In 2019, we were among the first federated states to contribute to this fund with $3 million. Last week, we more than tripled our support for the fund by contributing $10 million. This makes Quebec one of the most active federated states in terms of climate finance. We are pleased to be able to make this contribution, which we believe will provide real benefits to those who are most in need. The next IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability will show us the real scale of climate adaptation challenges in front of us. We already know that the communities that are hardest hit by climate change are the ones that are least equipped to cope with it. Now it's time to respond to the appeal of the Paris Agreement to substantially increase investment in climate adaptation and live up to its promises. The Glasgow COP represents an opportunity to accelerate action on adaptation, and we must take it. Merci beaucoup. Une bonne fin de journée.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Minister Charette, for really showing the leadership from one of the regions of the world and showing that the regions can also be a great player in this. You were one of the first regions to contribute to the fund, and now this pledge is certainly the biggest we have had from a region so far. So I would like to thank you for that. Our next speaker on the list will be connecting virtually. His Excellency Ms. Sohail Demir, Minister for Justice and Enforcement, Environment, Energy and Tourism from the Flanders region of Belgium.
Hello, many greetings from Flanders. Because of COVID of our cabinet, I cannot be in Glasgow, so I would like to address and to highlight the importance of the work of the Adaptation Fund. The stories of the devastating impacts of climate change are indeed countless. In Flanders, we have seen extended periods of droughts in the past years and terrible floods this summer. Countries that were already feeling these negative impacts have become even more vulnerable, and their struggle to tackle the consequences of climate change has become even harder. It goes without saying that adaptation to climate change now more than ever should have our full attention. And that's also why the Flemish government made a big plan, a Blue Deal, to adapt our region from climate change. So I fully support the approach of the Adaptation Fund, and I'm therefore pleased to announce on behalf of the government of Flanders and myself that we are committing a contribution of 3 million euros to the Adaptation Fund to continue its work to deliver results there where it matters to the most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Demir, for those words and your support, continued support for the Adaptation Fund, as the regions of Belgium has been long-time supporters also of the fund, and I'm very happy to see that this continues, and in this case, Flanders, the fund pledge from Flanders, we are very happy to, of course, see this continuing. I would now like to introduce the next speaker, who is Mr. Bard Vegar Solhelg, Director General from the Norwegian Agency of Development Cooperation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And let me commend the work of the Adaptation Fund. So we're in the rather sad situation that you can actually see the consequences of climate change happening on the ground around the world. In the Arctic, the fire forests of California, in the lower regions of South Asia, but also on the ground on the African continent. I just came back from a trip to Malawi and Tanzania, and in Malawi, weather patterns are changing, the land is becoming drier, and it's affecting agricultural output. And that's in a country which is the 4th poorest country in the world, and where the majority of the population depends on agriculture, living as smallhold farmers, like most of the African continent. Thus, we need to step up. And this year's Adaptation Gap report estimates that adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 times higher than current public finance flows to adaptation. We need to change the speed on adaptation on top of the important work we're doing on mitigation. Norway is one of very few countries that take pride in spending 1% of our gross domestic income on international development, and our new government in office just a month ago has stated that their vision and idea is to integrate climate and development in our international development policies fully. That is why Norway pledged a week ago that we will double climate finance from 2021 to 2026 from an already high level up to $1.6 billion US in 2026. And as part of that, we will triple our spending to climate adaptation. And that is why I'm also very pleased today to announce that we again are entering into an agreement with the Adaptation Fund with $35 million US. We do this, of course, because we trust the fund and think it's a great partner. It's a fund that can finance national institutions directly. And it's also an innovative fund. Through the innovation pillar, you pilot adaptation practices, products and technologies, which can be scaled up and to other climate funds, such as the GCF on a later date. So I can't promise, like my German colleague, that the money is already on an account, but it's on its way. Good luck with your important work.
Thank you, Director General, for the support of Norway and the newly signed agreement that you were referring to with the Adaptation Fund, and the leadership Norway is showing now that you are doubling climate finance and tripling it to climate adaptation. I would now like to give the floor to the next speaker, who is Ms. Federica Fricano, Director of European Affairs and International Actions on Climate Change Division from Italy.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a great pleasure for me to join this dialogue on behalf of Italy, as we recognize the importance work of the Adaptation Fund and that it has played to support the most vulnerable community by financing concrete adaptation and resilient process, which helps them address the worst effect of climate change. The Adaptation Fund plays a critical, particularly important role as it fosters a strong system of direct access, and we pay particular attention to that, the direct access to resources, while ensuring monitoring and transparency of approved projects. We find that this direct and innovative relationship between the funds and the beneficiary community is of extreme value, and it increases ownership and the action among the beneficiary country, which themselves became implementing agency. Since the resources to the adaptation part are provided mainly through voluntary basis, Italy has been contributed since 2015 with 1 million euro to the fund. In addition to the direct funding, we also work in synergy with the Adaptation Fund and with the Secretariat through projects of our bilateral cooperation. We do believe, as previous speaker has very well highlighted, that the Adaptation Fund creates tangible and positive results on the ground, focusing on strengthening the capacity of our developing countries partner for all climate finance mechanism, and it has demonstrated to be very effective as a global financial mechanism as well, since it's helping vulnerable communities to build a broader resilience against environment, but not only, also health and economic risk. And this approach has also allowed projects to further up directly to help with the COVID-19 crisis. Let's just remember that it was the Adaptation Fund was the first climate fund who approved new projects during the pandemic through a virtual decision-making process that offered online training, webinar, and case studies. It's for all the above, and in the context of the announcement that was made by our Prime Minister to almost tripling our finance contribution, reaching 1.54 billion for the next by next year and for the next 6 years, that we will continue. We are committed to the Adaptation Fund, and we will continue to support it also through our collaboration and championing the role of the Adaptation Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, for the support of Italy to the fund and for highlighting how you, for example, the direct access modality of the fund. As I'm told, I have to speed up a little bit here. I would like to introduce now the next speaker, who will be with us via video, Mr. Khalifa Al-Kuvari, Director General from the Qatar Fund of Development.
Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Qatar Fund for Development, we would like to thank the government of the United Kingdom for convening this year's COP26, an imperative platform for addressing the climate crisis. I would also like to express our appreciation to the UNFCCC and the Adaptation Fund for convening this event to address the adverse effects of climate change on vulnerable communities. Climate change introduces a huge threat to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal globally, particularly those in least developed countries and small island developing states. Urgent actions are needed to push for additional and accelerated solutions supporting vulnerable communities. Since 2019, Qatar Fund has introduced climate actions as one of its priority areas, collaborating with the strategic partners to address the adverse effects of climate change. In December of 2020, Qatar Fund for Development contributed to the Trust Fund for the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program to increase the resilience of vulnerable communities to the impact of climate change on food security and prevent displacement by improving preparedness and early warning system for natural disasters. Earlier this year, Qatar Fund contributed to the Adaptation Fund to finance climate change adaptation projects in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impact of climate change. The partnership between Qatar Fund for Development and the Adaptation Fund focuses on helping the most vulnerable countries adapt and build resilience to climate change through supporting disaster risk reduction, water management, ecosystem-based adaptation, food security, and urban development. We must come together hand in hand and take actions toward adapting sustainable solutions to build the resilience of vulnerable communities to climate change. We thank you once again for being here today with high hope that from this day onward, we'll be able to create a better future. We also seize this opportunity to renew our invitation, welcoming you all to Doha for the 5th UN Conference on the Least Developed Countries in January 2022, where a new program of action will be adopted to overcome development challenges. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Director General for the support from the Qatar Fund, who has been the first actually non-annex country to pledge to the Adaptation Fund, which is notable. I would now like to introduce our next speaker on the list, Ms. Valvanera Ulargui, General Director for the Climate Change Office of Spain. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. It is a pleasure to participate on behalf of the government of Spain in this contributor dialogue. Thank you very much to the COP presidency for organizing it. I think that all efforts that you have been made during this difficult year and that have allowed us to continue with the fund's activity and its mandate are very worth. Thank you very much. Big thank to the fund. And I also would like to highlight, as previous speaker, that this is the year where adaptation has more necessities than ever. So we need to be bold, we need to invest in all areas, but I think that this contributor dialogue is very, very important at COP26. You know that Spain has been part of the Adaptation Board since the very beginning. It's very close to our heart. And when impacts of climate change are becoming more evident, Spain wants to continue to support the adaptation and especially the work that you are doing. This is why the Climate Action Summit in New York, our president, a Spanish president, announced a new contribution of 30 million euros for the Adaptation Fund. We are very happy to do that, and we also want to work not only with the contribution, but also with the fund in disseminating the most relevant information on how to access funds resources. That is why we have worked, and we will be working together with the Secretariat, and especially with the Latin American and Caribbean region. We did a web seminar this year. It was very, very helpful, and we would like to still working on that direction. On the year to come and on the challenges that we have in front of us, I think that we need to ensure to strengthen all this effort of the good work that we have been done and enable funds to provide greater access for developing countries, also to look across the board, to reach in key sectors, and to be able to mainstream all our efforts and enhance cooperation with other climate funds. And this is the only way, we think, to build on global effective response. Thank you very much. I am convinced that we can do it and that we can work on that direction, and we are very happy to participate in this family. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the General Director for the support to the Adaptation Fund and not least the generous contribution that you just pledged from Spain. And I would now like to introduce our next speaker on the list, who is Mr. Matthias Bachmann, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Please, Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Matthias. And I would like to thank the COP presidency and the Secretariat for organizing this important meeting today. As others have already said, adaptation finance needs have never been higher. And I'm therefore very pleased to confirm the new contribution already announced by the President of the Swiss Confederation in the high-level segment, amounting to 10 million Swiss francs. This funding is complementary to other Swiss climate action engagements in the field of international bilateral and multilateral cooperation, and also to bilateral agreements under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. The contribution will help finance, of course, the Adaptation Fund's very effective work in supporting the efforts of the most vulnerable people around the world to adapt to the relentless impacts of the climate crisis. We look forward to the operationalization of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and we are confident that it will generate steady income for the fund. But at the same time, voluntary contributions will continue to be needed to finance the Adaptation Fund's impactful work. And we encourage all countries in a position to do so to contribute, and we are very encouraged about the contributions announced today. Chair, as you've mentioned at the outset, the Adaptation Fund is a successful, innovative, and inclusive example of climate multilateralism. Switzerland is happy to continue its long-standing partnership with the fund, its members and stakeholders in the years ahead to jointly build a climate-resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bashman, for the support of Switzerland, the continued support for the Adaptation Fund. I now would like to turn to the next speaker, which is, let me see here, Mr. Pento Chering, who is the representative of the chair of the LDC group from Bhutan. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation. It is my honor to represent the 46 least developed countries at this high-level event. Adaptation and building resilient societies are more needed today than ever before. Evidence tells us that we are not on the right track to achieve our shared goals. Compared to 2021 levels, global emissions are expected to increase 16% by 2030 instead of decreasing 45% as recommended by science. Deeper emissions cuts are urgently needed, and the LDC group will continue to insist on greater ambition. The climate crisis is only getting worse, and LDC group, which represents 1 billion people, are the most impacted. Every year, we grapple with cyclones, floods, droughts, unusually heavy rains, landslides, heat waves, and irreversible biodiversity loss. And as LDC, we have few resources to cope. Adaptation planning, preparedness, and actions are quite expensive and risky for conventional sources of financing. For LDCs, it is an important and enormous challenge to attract investments to build resilient infrastructure and implement adaptation actions. Adaptation Fund is close to our hearts, and we would like to recognize the role that the fund has played. Out of the 46 LDCs, at least 30 have accessed finance from Adaptation Fund. Also, in terms of accredited national implementing entities, 1/3 of the entities are from LDCs. The fund plays a very important role in delivering enhanced access to grant-based support for our national adaptation plans, priorities, and actions. We really value this support. In fact, my own country has benefited from the support of Adaptation Fund to improve climate resilience and increase rice system productivity of smallholder rice farmers. In 2019, the LDC group has launched our vision to be on a climate resilient development pathway by 2030 and deliver net zero emission by 2050 to ensure that our societies and ecosystems thrive. We need the Adaptation Fund to help us deliver this vision and remain relevant to the needs of LDCs. Our priorities are to improve the abilities of our communities to adapt to the effects of climate change, build resilience to climate shocks, and reduce vulnerability. We still face difficulties accessing enough adaptation finance. We must find ways to strengthen institutions in the LDCs as well as enhance capacities at national and local level. As many LDCs are preparing national adaptation plans, it is also important that the fund continues to support the most vulnerable countries in their efforts to implement these plans. This is particularly important considering our limited capacity and the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened poverty and inequality in our countries. Mobilizing national resources to support adaptation work has been highly jeopardized by the effects of pandemic. Our resources have been reprioritized and allocated to support the pressing needs of most vulnerable sectors of our population. We need to scale up new and additional finance for the Adaptation Fund to avoid significant deficit in the coming years. It is critical that efforts by all developed countries to mobilize and make climate finance accessible continue to grow. For LDCs, grants for adaptations are particularly vital. Volumes must be increased, but also access, as I mentioned before. We need predictable and sustainable resources for the Adaptation Fund to meet the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable communities of the world. This is not about aid. This is about materializing commitment made under the Paris Agreement. As LDCs, we are ready to work with our partners to make this happen. I would like to thank you once again. Thank you. Over to you, Chair. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Sharing, for being the witness of the importance that the least developed countries are showing for the Adaptation Fund. Now I would like to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Andrea Meza Murillo, Minister for Environment and Energy from Costa Rica. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be brief. I think the Adaptation Fund has been a critical partner in our efforts to implement adaptation projects, even in a middle-income country as Costa Rica. So we're very pleased to see the pledges to the Adaptation Fund. We think that it is vital to continue seeing it working. It plays a critical role to do a lot of piloting, to do a lot of innovation. Yes, we can scale up with the other facilities, but this facility plays a critical role. So it's just a brief message just to say that we're very pleased. We must continue to have, as the previous minister was saying from Bhutan, a predictable and continuous funding for the Adaptation Fund. This is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your support and also for being brief, being mindful of time as we're running late, and therefore I will not take up much more time. I would just like to thank all the speakers so far for their remarks and the announcements that we have heard. and that they're really a cause for hope, not only for the Adaptation Fund, for adaptation in general. And I would now like to give the floor to, for closing remarks, to Her Excellency Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Secretary of State for International Trade and COP26 of the UK. Please, the floor is yours again.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to everyone for the support you've demonstrated to the Adaptation Fund through your participation at this afternoon's event. I'm delighted to announce the UK will be contributing $20 million to the fund, and I'm very pleased others have announced such strong commitments today and look forward to contributions tomorrow to the LDC fund. So together, our commitments to the Adaptation Fund, speaking as someone who quite likes maths, represents the largest single mobilisation in its history of over $200 million. So I think it shows that together we can deliver on defending people from climate impacts around the world. So Matthias, let's continue those efforts over the years to come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for those remarks and your generous support to the Adaptation Fund. And I would just like to say that if our calculations are correct, we have heard pledges today of $232.6 million, which is much more than the Adaptation Fund has received historically. So I would just like to thank you all for this. And by that, we are 13 seconds from the end. So I like to thank you all for being here today and wish you a good continuation for the day. Thank you.